I'm the Adult Services Librarian for the Nevada County Community Libraries. Tonight is a finale event for the Nevada County Reads and Writes for 2020 and for our summer reading. We are so pleased to be able to welcome the author of our Reads and Writes book, Station 11, Emily St. John Mandel, interviewed by our local facilitator, Lori Burkhart Frank. Lori is a meeting facilitator and the facilitator for Nevada County Community Leadership Institute. She is a co-host on the KVMR program, The Sages Among Us, and a host for Embracing the Journey. If you have any questions, please go to the bottom of your screen. You should see a little icon with the Q&A or Q&A underneath it. You can also ask questions on our Facebook feeds or on the YouTube feed. We're more than happy to answer those. I'm going to keep an eye out and make sure they get transferred over to Emily. And please feel free to ask your questions at any point, and we'll get to them at the end of the talk. So without further ado, here's Lori.
Well, welcome, Emily. I want to give you a little bit of background about Emily. She's written 5 novels, including The Glass Hotel, her most recent novel, and The Station 11, which we were going to be talking about tonight. That's her 4th novel. Station 11 was a finalist for the National Book Award, the Penn Faulkner Award, and won the 2015 Arthur C. Clarke Award. Emily is joining us from New York City, where she lives with her family. So welcome, Emily. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you so much. I was so looking forward to doing this in person, but I'm glad we can at least do this.
Yeah, well, we have to be flexible, and
exactly.
So it's great that we can do this, and we welcome the audience. So thanks for joining us. And as Megan said, I've got a lot of questions that the library staff came up with to ask you, and then for the last 15 minutes or so, we'll be inviting you to ask questions in the Q&A. So not in the chat where you were communicating with us earlier, but in the Q&A. That way we'll make sure your questions get to Emily. So Emily, I'm going to start off with one of the questions that came from the library. Is how has your perception of your books, both Station 11 and The Glass Hotel, changed this year? And would you change anything if you could, or add anything?
I love that question. It's probably more relevant with Station 11 because The Glass Hotel is so new still. The things I would add or change, I did a lot of research into the history of pandemics when I was writing Station 11. And I have to say the pandemic in Station 11 is not particularly scientifically plausible. In real life, an illness that deadly, that moved that fast, would burn itself out before civilization could collapse. But I did want to get some sense of the mechanisms of mass contagion and some sense of the history there. So I spent a lot of time reading about the history of pandemics and writing that book. And somehow in all that research, something that just didn't quite click for me until our present moment is that being in a pandemic or not in a pandemic, it's a little less binary than one might imagine. I think that I thought of it as almost like an on-off switch, like you're either in a pandemic or not in a pandemic. But it turns out there's this really kind of surreal in between where, the experience that we had in New York City toward the beginning, and it was a little bit different in different areas of the country, but there was a very long period, like weeks toward the end of February and even into the beginning of March, where the pandemic was sort of here, but we weren't quite sure. It was kind of a thing, but not quite. And that just hadn't occurred to me that there could be an in-between. And now in New York City, I'm not going to say we're on the other side of it because we're not. And everybody's expecting that the fall will be worse. But we're in this strange period where we're on the far side of the curve. Cases are relatively low compared to what they were. So it's this weird time when it feels a little bit safer, like maybe you'll expand your quarantine bubble to 2 families instead of 1, that kind of thing. And it almost feels like the flip side of what we experienced at the beginning, where once more we're in a pandemic, but kind of edging out, but maybe not, and it might get worse. So yeah, that in-between state is something that hadn't occurred to me. And then one other thing about Station 11, which I'm not sure is something that I'd change if I could go back in time, but more something that would be different if I were writing the book now. Is there's a scene in Station 11 when the pandemic's just crashing down across North America and planes are being diverted. And a number of people are diverted to an airport in Michigan where they all get off the plane and they watch the news and all of them believe it. That was very plausible when I wrote the book in 2011, 2012. That is absolutely not plausible now. It's just a very different landscape of fake news and alternate facts and people kind of believing their own little silos of reality. So, yeah, I think that if I were writing the book now, the relationship that people have to the media would be very different.
Great. Thank you, Emily. And sticking right with the pandemic, the librarians realized that you spent many hours on survivalist message boards while writing the novel. And what kind of research did you have to do that helped you create this imagined future? And how did that research differ from how you prepared for your newest novel?
It wasn't that different. It was really just spending hours on the internet reading stuff. So it felt kind of similar, even though the material was so different. Yeah, I don't actually recommend survivalist message boards, but if you're trying to get some kind of a grasp of the practicalities of living way off the grid, they're pretty helpful. Stuff that just hadn't occurred to me, like the fact that gasoline goes stale after 2 years. I don't know how many post-apocalyptic books I've read where they're still driving cars in year 50, but apparently that's not really a thing. So, yeah, little details like that. Practicalities that you just don't think about, like you have to make your own soap, for example, that kind of thing. Yeah, so the message boards were unsettling. They were really good though for that kind of off the grid research. For my new novel, which is quite different, it surrounds a white collar crime that's based on the Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. That was more about reading court transcripts, which was fascinating in a totally different way and kind of heartbreaking, actually, just seeing the human impact of a white collar crime.
Thank you, Emily. So in Nevada County, we're a community that places strong emphasis on the art, and the way your novel approaches the importance of the art resonated with us. In your opinion, what role does art play for humans in the midst of a catastrophe versus the aftermath? And are there any recent examples where you've seen this? It's a long question. And if survival is insufficient, what about the arts do you feel makes it more life sufficient? And has that changed recently?
Right. Yeah. So that line, survival is insufficient, I came across that on an episode of Star Trek when I was 19 or maybe 20 years old. You just can't predict what random piece of media will stay in your brain for your entire life. It just kind of stayed with me. And as I was writing the book, it just seemed like such an elegant expression of something that I believe to be true. But I don't know that I'd limit it to just the arts. I think you could also encompass sports in that. The way I see it is, that line survival is insufficient. What it means to me is that as a species, we're never satisfied, nor should we be, with just the absolute basics of food, water, and shelter. We always need something more. And that's why, as a species, we'll do things like put on plays in refugee camps or play musical instruments in war zones. Now, to touch on another part of that question, one of my very favorite examples of this phenomenon, in my understanding, there was a fashion show in Paris immediately following the Second World War. So the city is in a state of disarray and deprivation. Invaders have literally just left. But it was really important to put on a fashion show, because they're civilized people. They need to, we need to have these things. And I don't think that need is too strong a word in that circumstance. I think that these things, maybe you could think of them almost as kind of grace notes, like some kind of grace on top of your life, beyond the basics of survival. Not to be too grandiose about it, but I think those things can remind us of what it means to be human, and can remind us that there's more than just surviving and getting by day to day. And I actually feel like we've seen that in the current crisis. Something that I find kind of amazing is that, with this pandemic raging and cities shut down and terrible economic uncertainty for a lot of people, if I go onto the website of any of my favorite bookstores in New York City, they all have little notices. Due to the high volume of orders, we're sorry to say that your order might be delayed. That's amazing. People are buying books, in the middle of a pandemic. They really need something that, they're not getting from CNN or whatever news source it is. So yeah, I think we're seeing that now, that we long for stories and we long for something more than just getting through the day. I think the arts can provide that.
Thanks, Emily. And I'm going to sneak in a question that's at the back here, but are you a Trekkie?
You know what? I feel like if it's a yes or no, then probably yes. But that word implies such an incredible level of fandom that I've never called myself a Trekkie. Like I don't speak Klingon, for example.
So why did you choose a graphic novel as an essential device in your novel? And what other forms of media interest you?
I really love graphic novels. So what that came out of, it was kind of interesting. Originally, when I was writing Station 11, I saw the graphic novel as being pretty unimportant. It was just a matter of thinking through my character, Miranda. And I had a very clear idea of who she was from the very beginning. I saw her as someone who'd graduated from art school and therefore needed a day job, which, as the graduate of a program in contemporary dance, was something I was very familiar with. So then I saw her as somebody practicing that day job around the margins of her art. I'm sorry, around the margins of her job. So then that begs the question, well, what is the art? I wanted it to be something she could do at her desk. So like no painting or sculpture, it's got to be something a little bit low key. So I thought, well, I like graphic novels. I've read maybe two. I thought they were wonderful. I'll make her a graphic novelist. So it started out as just kind of just that, like kind of basic character development. But then something kind of interesting happened, which is the more I revised the book, the more I realized that I kind of accidentally created this parallel between the Dr. 11 comic books in the book and then the wider world of the novel. So in the comic books, you have these characters marooned in a space station, or in other words, marooned in a strange new world, which is, of course, the situation of these actors and musicians in this post-apocalyptic world that they never could have imagined. So that condition of being kind of marooned and disoriented in a world we couldn't have imagined, which, as I say this, it feels very different to say this in the middle of a pandemic than it did before. We're kind of all there, to be honest. I would not have imagined this world 6 months ago. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But yeah, I realized I could use the Dr. 11 comic books as a kind of amplification device to amplify that sense of strangeness and disorientation and feeling marooned. And because different genres have different rules, in a comic book, you can do something like have a character say, I stood looking over my damaged home and tried to forget the sweetness of life on Earth, as Dr. 11 does. If you just drop that into a novel, it would feel kind of cheesy, but you can have a comic book character say it. And of course it's applicable to the broader project. Oh, and the other question, right. The second part of the question was about other forms of media.
You are good, because I'd already forgotten that.
It's not my first rodeo. Yeah, other forms of media. I love music and always have. I listen to a lot of music while I'm writing, and I think it probably affects the work to some extent. I also really love painting. I'm not doing it myself. I have no idea how to paint, but looking at other people's paintings.
So this is a question that we've already before the show began. We had a question, which was, we hear rumors about a miniseries adaptation. And how do you feel about adaptations? In an ideal world, what would the perfect adaptation look like for you? And was there anything that you wanted to put in this book that didn't work in the format that would work in a miniseries adaptation?
That's interesting. Yeah, you know what? I had to cut a few things out of the book just for the sake of velocity. And it was mostly other works that the actors were performing. I originally had them performing, I think it was Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet, were two, two performances they gave that didn't make the final cut of the book. So I would love to see that in the miniseries adaptation. And yeah, the rumors are true. There is a miniseries coming. So they filmed 2 episodes in Chicago in January, and I probably could have visited the set, but with apologies to any Chicagoans, Chicago in January is cold. I felt like maybe I'd catch up with the production later on, and then COVID hit and everything shut down. So my understanding is that they've finished all of the scripts. I think it's 10 episodes in the miniseries, and I feel like it kind of is my ideal adaptation. I haven't seen it. I'm not involved with the production, but I really trust the showrunner and head writer, Patrick Somerville, whom I've known since he was a novelist in Chicago a million years ago. The cast is pretty amazing. Yeah, I'm really
Share with
excited about it.
us. Can you share the cast?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Jeevan is Himesh Patel, who was in Tomorrow. I think that was his breakout movie, the one about the guy who's the only one who remembers all the Beatles songs. Mackenzie Davis is Miranda. She was just, sorry, not Miranda. She's Kirsten. She was just in, I think Terminator was her most recent movie. She's in Halt and Catch Fire, which I haven't seen, but I've heard it's great. Who else? Gael Garcia Bernal is Arthur. He's one of my favorite movie stars, so that's pretty exciting. And Danielle Deadweiler, who I believe was on Atlanta, she's Miranda. So yeah, it's just a lot of really exciting actors. It seems like a cool project.
Do we have a timeline for, COVID's changed everything.
COVID's changed everything. Yeah. I spoke to a producer today for a totally unrelated matter. And what he was telling me is that American productions are looking at New Zealand these days, where COVID is over. So yeah, I would imagine the practicalities of, flying the crew in, quarantining for 2 weeks, and then filming are fairly formidable. On the other hand, that might be the only option on Earth. So, yeah. Yeah, so it made me wonder if Station 11 will consider doing something similar, but I don't know.
That is exciting. So we have felt similar effects to those described in Station 11 here in Nevada County. We've had public safety power shutoffs when there was concerns about wildfire in the fall, so that all the power goes off for days at a time. And then with coronavirus shutdowns, and we've gone from zero internet when we don't have power to relying on it for absolutely everything we do, including tonight. So if the internet disappeared tomorrow, what would you miss most and what would you miss least?
My go-to is always that I wouldn't miss social media, but I'm pretty much off social media at this point because I dislike it, except for Instagram, which I do like. So yeah, but that's a neutral. I feel like I could take it or leave it. I would not miss those evenings that you spend doom scrolling, which is a word I never knew before until a couple of months ago. It's what it sounds like, scrolling through like litanies of doom about the coronavirus. And, you can go to some dark places and waste your evening. I would not miss that at all. What I would really miss is FaceTime. So my original Western tour for the Glass Hotel was going to, include a stop in Nevada County. That was part of it. And in that tour, I was going to take a weekend off and travel with my daughter. And we were going to go spend the weekend with my family in British Columbia. And I'm not going to see them again for a while. So FaceTime has been really important. So yeah, that is the thing that I would miss the most.
You just brought up the Glass Hotel, and what similarities do you see between your new novel, The Glass Hotel, and Station 11? And what about your previous work and how it's connected?
I think I have kind of a default style in a way at this point, which is I really enjoy writing books with nonlinear structures. I just find that to be a really interesting way to put a story together. And it's something that I find I really enjoy as a reader. One of my very favorite novels of the last few years was A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan, which if you think the Station 11 structure is complicated, that one is that's pretty wild. Yeah, so all of my novels have nonlinear structures with multiple points of view, which I also find to be a good way to tell a story. The balance that I've tried to strike in every novel I've ever written is I want the strongest possible narrative drive, which is to say, I want a lot of plot, but I never want to sacrifice prose style or character development. So, in a way, that's an idea or an ideal maybe that sort of unites all of my novels. And then there is actually a very specific crossover from Station 11 to the Glass Hotel, which is that I sometimes get really attached to characters. And in Station 11, I really enjoyed particularly writing Miranda and also Leon, who's a tiny character in Station 11. I think I ended up cutting a lot of Leon. That's the only reason I can think of why I like him so much, because I think he's like a page in Station 11. But anyways, he's a major character in the Glass Hotel, and Miranda's there as well. Those books take place in parallel universes.
I thought I recognized Miranda in the Glass
Yeah,
Hotel.
same Miranda.
So what books, post-apocalyptic, I have trouble with saying that.
It's really hard to say.
It is, or otherwise inspired you while you were writing Station 11 or the Glass Hotel? Did you have books that inspired you?
Um, yeah, I did. So this is kind of a funny thing to say about a book that I loved, but Cormac McCarthy's The Road kind of functioned as a negative inspiration when I was writing Station 11. And to be clear, I really loved that book. But I also had a very strong feeling that the world doesn't need another The Road. You probably only need one post-apocalyptic cannibalism novel. Like, just, that's it's not it doesn't need to be a crowded field. So I was very conscious writing Station 11 of not writing The Road, which again I loved, but it was a kind of negative example for me. The other book, and this also might sound a little bit strange because it is so different from Station 11, was a novel that came out in 1960 called A Canticle for Leibowitz by Walter Miller. And it's just a fantastic post-apocalyptic novel. I read it when I was about 15. It made a huge impression on me. It's a very different apocalypse than the one in my book. It's a nuclear holocaust, not a pandemic. But it just captured my imagination. And I think of that as the book that made me think about what the post-apocalypse could be, what the world might look like after the collapse of civilization. So, yeah, I would say that book was hugely influential for me.
Well, what books would you suggest for younger readers who are coping with and attempting to understand everything that's happened this year?
Um, you know what? I feel like I would be more comfortable deferring that question to a youth librarian, just because I don't know the YA world that well. And the books that I remember reading, as a younger reader, memory is such a tricky thing. I'm not convinced that the way I remember them is actually the way they were. So I'm hesitant to make a recommendation there.
Well, that's a great answer because we have great youth librarians.
I assume so, yeah.
In Station 11, you wrote about the events leading up to the pandemic, the start of the pandemic, and the rebuilding years, but you avoid the immediate aftermath. What are your hopes for our rebuilding as we face that immediate aftermath of this current pandemic?
I hope that we can find a way to depoliticize public health. That's just been incredibly destructive to us. And I tend to go to Canada as a sort of easy comparison because I have citizenship in both countries and I'm from there. It's just not, wearing a mask is not a political issue in Canada. You wear a mask during an airborne pandemic for the same reason you wear a coat when it's cold outside. Like, it's that simple. And I would love it if we could somehow come to that point, after this. Yeah, that's something I think about a lot. And maybe just healthcare generally. I understand the argument for privatized medicine. I'm not in favor of it because, again, I'm Canadian. So socialized medicine is not scary to me. But it seems like it's actually pretty dangerous for people to not have good health care during a pandemic. That that old trope, you're only as strong as your weakest link. You're only as strong as your least covered citizen, where healthcare is concerned. So yeah, that's the direction my thoughts have been going.
Well, the works of Shakespeare play a major role in your book, particularly King Lear and A Midsummer Night's Dream. Why those specific plays, and especially since we know you had to cut Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet?
Uh, yeah, I felt like both those plays just worked for those moments in the plot. So, A Midsummer Night's Dream. So, put yourself in the position of this traveling post apocalyptic theater company moving across the landscape. You come into a town with, that seems to be run by a really creepy prophet. What's the light, non-offensive entertainment that gets you out alive? You probably don't want to do Hamlet or like Julius Caesar. Probably A Midsummer Night's Dream is the safest choice. So I was kind of seeing that as just light summer entertainment. And then King Lear, partly just that it's my favorite of Shakespeare's plays, which probably doesn't say anything great about my psyche. It's very dark, but I love that play. More importantly, though, it struck me as both a good play for Arthur as a character. I liked the idea of echoing Lear's arc in Arthur's life, where Lear is isolated by power, makes a series of disastrous decisions, and loses 3 daughters. I saw Arthur as someone isolated by fame, who makes a series of, I guess I would say, careless decisions and loses 3 wives, just kind of lets them slip away. So I liked that echo there. More importantly, I felt like Lear was an appropriate play for that moment in the plot as the book opens. Because Lear is, on one level, a play about losing absolutely everything. And that is the situation of the people in the theater that night. This pandemic is just sweeping across the world. Everybody in the theater is about to lose absolutely everything, but they just don't know it yet. So yeah, it seemed like that was the play for that moment.
Well, what Shakespearean play do you most want to see these days?
King Lear. Yeah. Yeah, that remains my favorite.
And what inspired you to write about actors and musicians?
So I've never acted myself, but I'm married to a writer. My husband, Kevin, mostly writes short stories these days, but when I met him, he was writing plays. So that gave me a kind of secondhand exposure to actors and kind of the way off Broadway world in New York. They were so admirable to me. That's a world where nobody's just an actor. You're an actor slash waiter slash SAT tutor, whatever juggling act you have to do to practice your art. And what that means is that it's really about the art. These people are really dedicated to their art. So I really admired them. I also found myself thinking about experiences that I'd had where, my training is actually in contemporary dance. I was a dancer before I was a writer. And I look back at some kind of company experiences that I had, either a short term company where you convene for 2 months of rehearsals and then 2 weeks of performances, or this youth dance company I was in when I was 17 or something, where we were together all year. And it seemed to me that I could probably extrapolate those experiences and just kind of map them onto actors. That atmosphere of artistry and talent and neuroses and just the group dynamics you get in any group. Yeah, so I was just, yeah, I really admired I admired the actors that I'd met and wanted to write about that world.
Thank you. So if you had to explain this year to yourself when you were writing Station 11, what would you say?
I don't know. I mean, I keep a journal. So in a way, I've been explaining this year to myself all year, just trying to wrap my head around it. Yeah, there was a year when we couldn't travel anymore and the world became enormous. It used to not be that big a deal for me to fly across the continent and see my family. But now I feel like I'm on the far side of the world in 1750. You just can't get there from here. Yeah, a world when we all retreated from the world into our homes, when our bubbles became incredibly small, when we spent all our time in our houses and gardens. It's I think it's something that all of us will be grappling with for a while. Just the strangeness and shock and candidly trauma, even if you haven't directly lost anyone. Because even if we haven't directly lost anyone, we have lost a whole world, and that's not nothing. The things that we used to take for granted. Not just travel, but spending time indoors with friends, the simple things. So, yeah, I think we'll all be dealing with this time for a while.
Well, post-apocalyptic novels have a unique ability to critique society. What critique do you think Station 11 offers? And has your interpretation of your own work changed with the recent events?
That's interesting. I didn't really see myself as critiquing society too explicitly in Station 11, except for like the really little petty things that were bothering me at the time. Like there's a whole riff about airplanes where the last flight to Los Angeles leaves from that post-apocalyptic airport. And the pilot's like, hey, if anybody wants to come to Los Angeles, I'm going. And that was how people realized the world had ended because, in the era where they were used to paying hundreds of dollars for the privilege of 3 extra inches of leg room and the life or death stakes of the exit row, they're getting a free plane ticket. So, yeah, I guess I was making a statement about the way airlines would nickel and dime us. But yeah, otherwise, I suppose one could extrapolate statements about sort of celebrity culture and the weirdness of that. But yeah, I wouldn't say I'd thought of the novel overall as a societal critique.
So there are many, talking about Arthur now, there are many small moments in Arthur's life that hold greater significance later in the novel's storyline. Are there any moments in your life that hold greater significance now?
You mean in light of the pandemic?
Yeah.
Yeah, just really little things. My birthday's toward the beginning of March, and that turned out to be the last normal day. So like the things we did that day, which were very kind of simple, non-extravagant things. I picked my daughter up from preschool early that day and took her to her favorite playground, which is about a 2-mile hike through Brooklyn. I love the walk, and it's an incredible playground. And it would have been unfathomable to think that her school was going to close 48 hours later and we'd be indoors for the next 4 months. So, yeah. So you look back at those moments and it's like, I just remember the playground so vividly. And the two of us met my husband for dinner that night, a couple of neighborhoods away from where we live. And I don't think I'd remember that meal very vividly if that wasn't the last time I had a meal in a restaurant. So, yeah, I think anything that sort of sneaks up on you the way this catastrophe did, you suddenly look back at these fairly mundane moments and they're freighted with this crazy significance you never would have imagined. Which, as I say that, is kind of the situation of the Museum of Civilization in the airport, where, you're not going to save your boarding pass unless that's your last boarding pass. Or, that random pair of high-heeled shoes, you probably would have gotten rid of it unless they were never making those again. So, yeah, it's interesting how both moments and objects can become freighted with this incredible significance.
And this is my question. So I apologize, librarians, but you're talking about you use the word freighted. And in both the books, you have shipping is a big theme. And where does that come from? Is that a connection in your real life or an interest?
It's a very weird interest, which I can't quite account for. I'm used to interviewers' eyes kind of glazing over when I start talking about it, so I'll keep this brief. But years and years ago, during the 2008-2009 economic meltdown, I came across a fascinating article about shipping in the Daily Mail. I think the writer's name was Simon Perry. The title of the article, it was something like Revealed, the Ghost Fleet of the Recession. And it described this kind of surreal and weirdly beautiful situation where all of a sudden the shipping companies around the world had way more capacity than they needed, because if nobody's buying goods, you don't need to ship them from China. So what do they do with all the ships? The system isn't set up with places to park ships. They're kept in constant motion. So the very strange solution these shipping companies had come up with was just anchoring the ships 100 miles south of Singapore Harbor. So from the perspective of the people who lived on the coast of Malaysia, they came down to the beach one night and it was like a floating ghost city of lights that appeared instantaneously on the horizon. And it just kind of grabbed my imagination. I was really struck by that image. And as I began reading more about it, kind of struck by that world. We don't think about shipping because we don't have to. Everything kind of arrives on schedule, and we don't really think about how the goods arrive in our stores. But they do arrive, and real people pilot them through the Panama Canal. And I think it's that combination of scale and invisibility that makes shipping kind of interesting to me.
Well, thank you. I've been really curious on that one. There's so many relationships that are described in the book, from frivolous to life-changing. And what were your inspirations for these different relationships and for the way you form these different communities? What relationships sustain you?
My relationships with my family and friends, which is probably the most boring answer, but it's true. Yeah, especially with my 4-year-old daughter. We spend a lot of time together now that childcare is somewhat limited. Um, I'm trying to think. I don't feel like I have specific inspirations for relationships between individuals in my books. There I'm just kind of thinking about who these characters are and try to think of how they would plausibly relate to each other. But I do find myself perpetually interested in group dynamics. The traveling symphony in Station 11 or the office chorus in the Glass Hotel. And I think that just stems out of, just my working life and my life as a dancer. Where when I was a dancer, I'd be in companies or in a group or a class or whatever. You're always in a group as a dancer. And then later on in my working life, I was an administrative assistant for 12 years, up until about a year after Station 11 came out. And I was just always kind of fascinated by office dynamics. Or, I was in a lab for the last job. So, like lab dynamics, same thing, the way any given group of people relate to each other. The sort of tensions and petty intrigues, and she likes him, but he doesn't like that guy, all that stuff. Yeah, I've always found that kind of interesting to write about.
How do you approach writing? And is there any advice for the budding young writers in our community?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to preface this by saying there's no right way to write a novel. I definitely have friends who will not sit down and write the first chapter until I know exactly how the book's going to end. I'm kind of the opposite of that. I just kind of wing it. So I'll just start writing a scene, and then the scene becomes a chapter. The story begins to sort of suggest characters and connections that could be made. And after about a year of that, I have an incredibly messy first draft. So for me, writing a novel, it's really a process of revision. The first draft is pretty much incoherent. And then I just go over it over and over and over again for, in the case of the Glass Hotel, like 3.5 years. It was really an intense revision process there. So that's how I write a novel. The other part of your question, advice for young writers. I heard some really great advice from Neil Gaiman once, who's a writer who I really respect. And his advice was finish what you start. And I think that's really wise because it's kind of easy to start anything. Anyone can write like one good sentence. But what happens is you write your one good sentence and then you get going with character development and you're going along and then you get kind of bored and the characters don't make sense and your plot's full of holes. You don't know how to fix it. So you set it aside and move on to the next thing. And I think that Gaiman's point was that it's by working through those difficult moments that you become a better writer. So I think that's really good advice. Other advice I'd give, you'll never have as much time to write as you want. You're always either balancing your writing with a day job or with family responsibilities or both. And so if you can train yourself to write anywhere under any circumstances, that's really helpful. Can you write for a half hour at Starbucks during your lunch break instead of scrolling through Instagram? Like that'll help. You'll get further ahead. Um, Tied to that, an idea that I've personally found really helpful is to be a little bit ruthless with your time, which sounds kind of awful, but it's been a helpful principle to me. What that might mean is that you don't get to watch as much television as you'd like to. There are shows I've been meaning to get to for years. What it also meant for me in the pre-pandemic world where I used to see people was, if I had a couple of coffee dates with friends in a given week, I would never schedule a third thing because I needed that time to write. Also, I'm not going to your poetry reading, like unless I'm really genuinely interested. So yeah, so bowing out of social obligations that you don't want to go to. You're so sorry, but you have other plans that night. They don't need to know that your other plans are to stay home and write. That's private. Yeah, you just have other plans. Yeah, so those things have been really helpful to me as principals.
Those are great pieces of advice. And one of our librarians found an interview where you also offered advice that somebody had given you, which is be someone who you'd want to work with. And
Yeah, that's important. That's really
yes,
important.
so they wanted to know
Yeah.
what kind of qualities make a writer someone you'd want to work with.
Um, you know, I appreciate you bringing that up because so there's advice for writing, but then there's advice for publishing, which is very related, but two different things. So yeah, publishing advice. Being someone you want to work with, basically like just be a decent human being. Like it's not rocket science. But an experience I've had a couple of times is I've been to some international festival and there'll be some really big name author who sells a lot of tickets to their events. And I can tell they're not going to be invited back because they're impossible. So like, don't be that person. Often opportunities can kind of come along through, through somebody wanting to work with you. Like someone on Twitter is putting together an anthology, that kind of thing. Well, are you a horrible person on Twitter? Or are you pretty pleasant? So stuff like that. Just being generally someone who other people would want to be in the same room with, I think is really important. So that's probably the most important publishing advice. But just one other thing I'll say on the topic of publishing and kind of, your professional life as a writer. Don't assume that the publishing world is closed to you. I think there's a really damaging idea that you have to know the right people or live in Brooklyn or go to all the parties or get an MFA. And you really don't. It's kind of a long, boring story, but I don't have a high school diploma. And like I've been okay. I didn't know anybody going in. So yeah, just keeping in mind that the publishing world is full of people whose job is to find good writing. So you just try to write well.
Well, I'm sure that there'll be some questions that you've spurred, and in a moment we'll invite the audience to ask questions. I've got some here already, but there's one more question I want to ask you that the librarians prepared, and that's that they read you grew up on an island off the coast of British Columbia, and how does that compare to living in New York? And do you miss the proximity to nature? And how are those experiences reflected in your writing?
I love that question. Yeah, if you've read Station 11, I grew up on the island in Station 11. I slightly changed the name. If you ever wanted to visit in New York in real life, that's Denman Island, British Columbia. And it's exactly the way I described it. It's 1,000 people, and like forest and deer. It's pretty beautiful. Sometimes when you're a teenager, you just kind of want the opposite of what you have. So I left that spectacularly beautiful natural place and moved to Toronto. And then a couple of cities later, I landed in New York. I do miss the proximity to nature, but I don't think I want to live in it again. I loved it so much at the time, but it can also feel isolated in a way that didn't suit me, which is kind of ironic because I spend a lot of time alone. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to be able to see my neighbors, and there's so much rain in British Columbia during the winter. I just have a lot of memories of like long winters of pouring rain, looking out of the dripping forest. And there's a vitality about cities that I love. So yeah, I can't see myself living in it again, but I do fantasize about some kind of dream life where I can somehow have both, spend different parts of the year in different places.
Well, we're going to take some questions from our audience. And Catherine or Christiane asked, at the beginning of the coronavirus, she found herself refusing to think about Station 11. I would tell my students, because she's a teacher at high school, not to think about it. It just freaked us out so much. And did it freak you out?
Yeah, it did. Well, I should qualify that a little bit. It the pandemic in Station 11 is so much worse, and that's not to minimize anything about the horror of what we're going through now. But that was like an insane mortality rate in Station 11, which in retrospect was way more than I needed for dramatic impact. Another thing to go all the way back to your very first question, I would not have guessed that an illness with such a low mortality rate would cause such chaos, but here we are. So, what I was really kind of afraid of wasn't the pandemic itself, but I was afraid of being perceived as somehow profiting off it. Um, so I got a lot of interview requests, like people wanting to talk about Station 11 and what it's like in the current moment, having written Station 11. And I didn't want to give that perception. I just felt gross at the thought of it. And so yeah, that was probably the only thing about having written Station 11 that freaked me out at the beginning of the pandemic.
Well, Bruce has a question here, is how would you compare Station 11 to Ling Ma's Severance, which is also about a pandemic? And I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but I haven't read it yet. It's one of the books on my to be read bookshelf, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I've heard it's good, but I can't make a comparison.
Let's see, Elenita, I'm sorry if I'm saying that wrong, but in chapter 26, Dahlia says, you probably encounter people like him all the time, high functioning sleepwalkers, essentially. Do you think that's a problem in the US?
I think it's a problem all over the world. It's not specific to this country. I think you can just kind of get stuck in a groove and it can be really hard to get out. And you don't mean to become sort of a person of strict habits who's increasingly narrow-minded, but it happens, if you don't make an effort, I guess, to not sleepwalk, which I have no recipe for not doing. It's really hard. But yeah, I do think it's a problem generally, just in the world.
Let's see, and an anonymous attendees asked, what are your feelings and thoughts about Station 11 when this COVID, what were your feelings and thoughts about the book when the COVID started? And I think you talked a little bit about that, but do you have more to say on that?
What I had was this almost kind of frustration where, and these are really spectacularly privileged problems, but I was promoting the Glass Hotel, and which meant talking about Station 11, which I was fine with on principle. But a question that kept coming up was, what are you, some kind of prophet? Like, you predicted all this. And I had this frustration because I had done a lot of research into pandemics. So what I knew from that research is that there's always going to be another pandemic. And of course, that's not the same thing as actually being prepared to live through one, but that was a thing. So yeah, that was something that came up a lot.
And Christiane has another question. Another context that she's curious about is Black Lives Matter. Do you wish that you had made the culture that lasted more diverse? It seems like most of the things that retained their value had a Western European roots.
Oh, that's interesting. I did make the survivors diverse. Yeah, I'll have to think about that more. I guess I'd kind of been thinking about the culture that I've mostly seen around Michigan, and all the traveling that I've done there, which is not to imply that Michigan's not diverse. It is, but not so much up around Traverse City and Sutton's Bay. Yeah, I appreciate that question. I'll have to think about that more.
That's great. And I don't have any questions. So if you've been holding back, participants, go ahead and type them in, but I have lots left to ask Emily here. So you've spoken before about writers, particularly fiction writers, needing to have empathy to write characters well. And who do you empathize most with in Station 11 and in the Glass Hotel?
In Station 11, I'd have to say Miranda and also Clark. I found that those were the two characters who I found myself the most connected to. but I did have some empathy for all of them. Although Elizabeth was a struggle, I kind of couldn't stand her, so it was really hard to write that character. But yeah, even Arthur, who is objectively a fairly terrible husband and neglectful father, I kind of felt like he wasn't a bad guy. Like he'd started out with really good intentions and didn't mean to get quite so warped along the way. So yeah, I'd say I empathize with all of them to some extent. I'm trying to think if there's someone in particular in the Glass Hotel. I'd have to say Vincent. She's maybe my favorite character I've ever written, and certainly my favorite in the Glass Hotel. And even though some of the decisions that she makes are questionable, she kind of agrees early on to essentially become a trophy wife. That's that was an understandable decision to me. And just thinking about her character and her background.
We have a couple more questions that have come in, and Melissa is asking, earlier you mentioned the linearity of your plots, and can you talk a bit about your writing process regarding how you bring multiple plot lines or points of view together?
It's all in the revision. That's like my whole secret. Yeah. So, I mentioned the way I start a novel. I'll just start writing a scene and kind of see what happens. But then what inevitably happens is I get completely stuck and I have no idea where I was going. So with Station 11, I remember a moment of thinking, okay, I've got 3 chapters from Jeevan's perspective. Where was I going with this again? You kind of end up in this cul-de-sac if you don't have a plan, which I never do. So what I do in that case is I just set that aside and jump to a different timeline and a different character. And, sometimes you don't even end up keeping that chapter, but it's helpful in just figuring out what the book is. So, yeah, I just kind of jump all over the place in the narrative, writing different sections of the book completely out of order, and then figure out how it all goes together later. And any kind of coherence or cohesion or even like readability as a work in the English language, comes through the revisions. So, I just go over those books so many times. And at first, I'm fixing massive problems. Either the structure will completely not work, or there'll be crazy plot holes, or characters will disappear halfway. And then, as you keep revising, the problems get smaller and smaller and smaller until you're just kind of obsessively moving commas around. So, yeah, it's all revision for me.
Well, Kimberly has asked, what's next for Emily?
I've been writing television, which has been really fun. I'm working on a TV adaptation of The Glass Hotel. And, I love writing novels, but after 5 novels, it's kind of fun to try something completely different. So, yeah, I've been writing TV episodes, and I just started working on a new novel, which is really not far along at all, but I'm kind of excited about it.
So we have another question that came in from Julie. And she's a writer who is always saying, but I don't have an MFA. And I appreciate that you bring that simple point up as just finishing what you started. Excuse me. It's like you're speaking to her.
Oh, that's nice.
But you mentioned that you don't even have a high school diploma. And she's curious of your writing and publishing trajectory and would ask you to expand on that a little bit.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. So to back up even a little bit further to the high school diploma, I was homeschooled by hippies in the woods, and that that kind of eventually led to not having a high school diploma. Can you still hear me, by the way? You're frozen.
A couple of minutes left for, oh, there you are. You're back.
Yes. Okay. Good. Okay. You're back.
Homeschooled.
Okay, so yeah, homeschooled. I did a semester or 2 of community college, but I never did 12th grade math, so no high school diploma. And then I auditioned for this professional conservatory program in contemporary dance, because dance was really my focus. I'd always written just as a hobby since I was a little kid. There was a period of time when I was about 8 years old when one of the requirements of the homeschool curriculum was I had to write something every day. So that got me in the habit of writing, and it was just a hobby that I loved but didn't take seriously until I was about 21, maybe 22. And I just found that I didn't really enjoy dance anymore. Somehow all the joy had gotten sucked out of it. And so that kind of begged the question, well, now what? I had no high school diploma. I had student loans from the dance program, so I wasn't going back to college. And I just started to take my writing more seriously. And I started writing what eventually became my first novel, Last Night in Montreal, which took a really long time to write because for a lot of that time, I wasn't really thinking of myself as a writer. You know, I'd still go to the occasional dance audition, I'd put the book down for a month, pick it up. So it took about 4 years to write. And then finally, I had what seemed to me to be a pretty good draft, which seems hilarious in retrospect. I think the draft was a mess. But yeah, I had what I thought was a good draft. So I started Googling literary agents. And I'm going to pause for a second to say that's not actually the best way to find an agent. You know, if you're a writer starting out, the best way to find an agent is finish your project, your novel or your story collection or whatever it is. Find books that are in some way similar, and then find out who the agent is on that book. And it's easy to find. They'll be in the acknowledgments or the author's website, usually. And then you're in a really good position to send a letter to that agent and say, I noticed you were the agent on book X. And as my new work is similar to book X in the following ways, I wondered if you might be interested in taking a look. And that tells the agent that you're a serious person who's done their research. But what I did was I Googled agents. I came up with a list of people who represented literary fiction in New York City. And I just started sending out a query letter and 3 sample chapters, like working my way down the list. And usually I get rejected within 24 hours. It was like a really fast turnaround. But the 13th or 14th person I queried was Emily Jacobson at Curtis Brown, to whom Station 11 is actually dedicated. She requested the full manuscript and then she rejected it. But she did so with this really long, thoughtful editorial letter, which was basically a list of problems she had with the book, you know, things she didn't understand. I wasn't quite sure why character A did this, or, you know, I'm not quite sure why this happened. And I read through it, and it seemed to me to be really good feedback. So I thought, well, there's no guarantee of future representation if I take this person's advice. But worst case scenario, I'll have a better novel. Okay, so the agent, Emily Jacobson, she took me on as a client, and she was kind of old school in her business practices. She was in her mid 80s when she took me on and just had a way of working from a very different era. So she sent the book out to one publisher at a time. So it took 2 years to get rejected by every publisher in New York City. It was, yeah, she'd send the rejection letters in batches of 5. So yeah, finally the book landed with this really small publisher in the Midwest called Unbridled Books. They were wonderful. I stayed with them for 3 books. And then my 4th book was Station 11. And I felt like I maybe had a somewhat more commercial premise than I had with my previous works, and decided to try to go to a bigger house. So yeah, that was how I did it.
So I'm sorry, everybody else who had questions. We were actually reaching the end of our time with Emily. She's actually on the East Coast, so it's getting quite late for her. We don't want to keep her too long. But do you have any last thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
You know, I'd just like to thank all of you so much for joining in this Zoom with me. I was really looking forward to coming to your town in person, and I hope I can do it someday. But this has been great, and I really appreciate it.
All right, thank you so much, Emily.
Great, thank you.
Okay, well, we do want to say thank you to Emily one last time. Thank you to everyone for watching. We really appreciate you being a part of this. And of course, we want to thank the National Endowment for the Arts for giving us this ability to have this talk. They went out of their way and helped us make this happen. I want to thank the Friends of the Nevada County Library and the Friends of the Truckee Library. We want to thank our partners, the Nevada County Superintendent of Schools and the Nevada County Arts Council, for all the work that they've done. So stick around for a few more minutes for a sneak peek at next year's Nevada County Reads and Writes. But first, we're going to go to Priya from Behavioral Health to talk about some exciting stuff that she's up to.
Thanks, Megan. Hi, everyone. My name is Priya Cannell, and I work with the Nevada County Behavioral Health Department. Thanks for your time. It sounded like a really great conversation. So I just wanted to share a new resource initiative that Behavioral Health Department has started up recently, and it's called Let's Talk Nevada County. You can find more information at www.letstalknevadacounty.org. And really the real push behind Let's Talk Nevada County is acknowledging that in these times right now, both with the pandemic and what's going on in the world and the country in general, life can leave us feeling really stressed and anxious and oftentimes isolated. So we're really trying to encourage the community to remember key tips about self-care, as well as really leaning on our connections and our natural networks of support. It's now more than ever so important to lean on each other, reach out, stay connected. And so, we have some resources on our website for, individuals who might need more support. We have a local crisis line that can be reached at 530-265-5811. But also we're just encouraging people to, again, lean on those natural networks of support. So, send a text, give a call to someone who might be extra isolated right now. Check in on people and dig a little deeper beyond how's it going. Maybe ask what they might be struggling with and how you can be of support. And write a letter. That's another great idea that came up. We're in a more technological age now, but it's always nice to get something physical and paper in the mail to let someone know you're thinking of them. So I just wanted to share that resource with everyone. Again, it's www.letstalknevadacounty.org, and check it out. Check out some of the resources there, some of the tips around self-care and supporting others and yourself.
Well, thanks, Prisha. And I'm wondering if we did get Paul back. Megan, did you want to jump into some of the previews for the next Nevada County reads?
Hi, everybody. So let me just read this email from Paul for things that he did want to talk about. So he wanted to remind everyone of the evacuation tags that they have going out for from the Office of Emergency Services. So if there is some sort of emergency, you can pick up a tag from the county and just put it somewhere where firefighters can see, so they don't have to check every single residence. They'll be able to see quickly and easily and move on and do their job just a little bit better. And we wanted to remind everyone about the Code Red test that's coming up on August 11th. So that's going to happen so soon, so keep an eye out. And if you haven't signed up for Code Red, please do. It is a quick and easy service that allows us to reach out to everyone in a specific area. So you put in like your neighborhood or something like that, and it'll reach you specifically where you are. Then I also had an announcement from the census. I'm trying to pull that up right now.
While you do that, I want to just talk about that new website that the OES just launched. And let's see, I know you can get to it from the Nevada County OES site. Don't remember, it's very simple to remember, but I don't remember. But oh my gosh, it's so cool. It's got, lets you know if there's evacuation routes, if there's any concerns that you might have. It lets you pre-map different ways you might leave your home if we did need to evacuate. So it is just a really cool website, and you could go to Nevada County and OES, and I know that it's there. I just don't remember the website name, but that is something I hope all of us check out. It's the best county website next to the library that I have seen, and I just really enjoyed looking at it and seeing all the different aspects of really great information, including the PSPSs, so that you know what's going on in terms of power, when that will inevitably happen, probably in the fall. So Megan, did you find your information about the census?
Yes, I did. So we have a few things that are coming up. Also on August 11th, that's when the enumerators go out. So those are the people that go and find you if you haven't responded to the census, not in a creepy way, but they do work for the national census, and they go from door to door for people who haven't replied to their prompts to fill out the census, and they do it all in person and on paper. So that's coming up. So if you want to avoid that knock on your door, go ahead and fill it out. It's super easy. You can fill it out via phone. There's a phone number that's super accessible, or you can fill it out online. It's only 9 questions. They're simple and confidential. The census is safe and secure. They're totally a separate agency from the government, and no one else can access that information. And there is no citizenship question. That's not something that's going to happen.
And you can call 211.
Yes, and you can call 211 and they can help you out with that. They can send you to the right place or help you with any questions that you have, because they have all the good info. And we do want to emphasize that the census will boost our economy and will be key in our recovery after COVID-19. I know a lot of people are struggling right now. The census is really what helps them decide how much funding we get, what kind of help we get, and this is how that's decided. So this is super important, especially right now. And really quick, we also have a message from our literacy coordinator, Natalie.
And while you're looking for that, I just wanted, if Judith is still on the call, I just wanted to say, you'd asked about which TV shows has she written, and I believe that Emily said that she's writing a TV show based on the Glass Hotel. So I don't think she said that she'd had any. I think that was the new experience for her. We just ran out of time, or I would have asked her directly for you.
Nick is still with us. Nick, do you want to say anything? Raise your hand if you're interested in introducing yourself to our county. Our new county librarian is here with us, and he's probably really mad at me for putting him on the spot like this. But he's been absolutely fantastic and very helpful. But let's dive in. Okay, next year. Oh, is he willing to talk? He is. Okay, so he'll be here in just a moment. But next year, we're going to be talking about our new Nevada County Reads and Writes book for 2021, which is The Roundhouse by Louise Erdrich. So that's going to be really fascinating. But first, let's see if we can check in with Nick here. Hi, Nick.
Hey, how are you?
We're doing well. How are you?
I am great. Thank you. You did a wonderful job tonight. And thank you for to everyone that is here. I'm just looking forward to opening up eventually as soon as it's safe and starting to meet people and really getting to know the community. Thank you for such a warm welcome from all the staff and everybody I have met. And I hope everyone has a really wonderful weekend.
All right, thank you. Okay, back to our little preview of Nevada County Reads and Writes 2021. Our programs are going to start in February. We're in our planning stages right now for exactly what that's going to look like. But you can expect definitely some crafts. We're going to have some writing workshops, maybe even a little art therapy to mix it up. We're working with the superintendent of schools to get some stuff in there. I know they have some book clubs planned with the library with other books as well. If you have a younger reader and don't feel comfortable reading The Roundhouse with them, you can always read The Birch Bark House by the same author, Louise Erdrich. And she's got a bunch of good books out as well that you can check out. We're getting a bunch of copies for everyone. And we're also hoping to work with the local tribe, the Nisenan group, Chirp. We've worked with them before and we absolutely love working with them, and we have a lot of things in common when it comes to this book, and I think it's going to be an amazing read for everyone. So thank you, Nevada County. Thank you for joining us. We had a wonderful time. Emily was amazing, and please look forward to what's coming.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Lori.